You're listening to the Virtue Podcast, brought to you by the Great Hearts Institute. Good conversations around the great conversation. Welcome back to the Virtue Podcast, and I am so happy today to be introducing Mr. Joshua Gibbs. Joshua Gibbs, longtime teacher at Veritas Christian School in Richmond, Virginia, but he's also been a lecturer on pedagogy. He's written a book. A second book is on the way, loads of articles. I think I first ran into him at the Society for Classical Learning, or maybe it was a Circe conference. He's an Alcuin fellow. He's got all the bona fides. So we can talk about that at some point in the course of our conversation. But I'm just delighted to have him on the podcast, in part because, well, Josh, you really do know how to turn a phrase. I think it's your writing that has really captured some folks' attention. Really happy to have you with us today, Josh.
Very glad to be here. Thanks, Rob.
Been teaching, as I said, for, nearly 20 years. And you started working with other teachers, certainly in the last decade, probably even a little more than that. You're committed to helping folks understand and deepen their understanding of the craft of teaching. So tell me this, how did you come to discover some of those trade secrets of teaching?
I think that it was maybe in my first year teaching at a classical school that I realized I was working alongside a much better teacher than myself. I was working alongside a really remarkable teacher, a friend of mine who still teaches. And I had been at a non-classical school for 3 years prior to that point. And I would say that the first 3 years that I spent teaching weren't spectacular. I wouldn't say I was an arresting lecturer. I was very young. I was in my early to mid 20s. And it wasn't until I started teaching at a classical school that I had a strong example to follow. And I was working alongside a fellow who is one of my best friends, my best friend in the world. And I observed that his classroom demeanor was just different than anything I'd ever seen. His classroom demeanor was different than anything I had ever seen back when I was in school or as a teacher. And I wanted to imitate him. I thought he had something really interesting, really profound and effective going on. And so I spent after I worked alongside him, I spent the next several years trying to teach the way that he taught. And at a certain point, I thought, I think I have it down. I think that I'm doing in the classroom what he was doing when I watched him teach.
Right.
And after I observed how much better my classes were imitating him, I wanted to put myself out there as someone that could be imitated as well.
I think it's fantastic. I mean, we talk about mimesis, right? We quote our Aristotle, but you experienced it firsthand, right? I mean, it came to you, and then you thought, wait a minute, if this worked for me, little old me, I might have something to share with others as well.
That's right. And the fact that I could imitate him with some practice, with some devotion and some dedication to speaking the way that he spoke and interacting with students the way that he did. With some practice, I found that I could do it. It wasn't something magical that he was doing. It wasn't something that was born out of a unique charisma that you either had or you didn't. It was something that could be learned.
I think this is so important. I think you know this well, but many teachers are overwhelmed when they see those more charismatic or seemingly more gifted teachers and think, gosh, I just couldn't do that. I could never do that.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, you found it, and you wanted to share it, and you've been writing about it. So let me back up and just say, has the writing component been a part of it as far back as you can look in your professional development? What's the relationship between your writing and your teaching? That's really what I'm interested in.
Well, when I went to college and studied English with a creative writing track.
Okay.
And so I've been writing short stories since I was 15 years old. And it was what I studied in college, and it's a great love of mine. But I found that what I had learned in college, so far as writing short fiction went, was deeply helpful in the classroom, given that so much of what I studied in the way of short fiction was just about human psychology, how people think, how you interest people, how you attract them, how you win them over to a point, where tension comes from. I mean, like I got a good, very basic education in the way of storytelling theory. And I found that a lot of what I'd been doing with stories, I was simply doing with students in the classroom. And so it just started to make sense to write about the classroom, because what I was doing in the classroom seemed to me a natural extension of the fiction writing that I had done since I was very young.
You know, that's kind of neat on a number of levels, but essentially, when we think of the fact that narrating the subject matter, right, be it history, be it the scientific enterprise, even the puzzlements of mathematics, right? Those are human enterprises. Those are human activities.
That's right.
And if we tell those stories, who knows? We might get students caught up in those stories for themselves. So
that's right.
I'm delighted to hear that. Hey, maybe you just tell us who are 2 or 3 of the writers who have influenced you the most.
From the realm of classics, I would say that Edmund Burke, more than anyone else, is a favorite thinker, favorite writer of mine. He's no longer alive, but I think that while he was alive, Roger Scrutin was probably the greatest disciple and interpreter of Edmund Burke's. Scrutin had an amazing way of appropriating Burke's ideas, not only in a modern context, but to Americans. Even though Scrutin was English, he was very good at appropriating conservative principles to America. So between Burke and Scrutin, I would say almost all of my ideas are borrowed from one of those 2 fellows.
Hey, those aren't bad sources to borrow from. There's that saying, which I won't be able to quote, but you know, the great writers are always lifting or stealing, right, from the great writers who precede them. So you're in pretty good company there. Are there any specific aspects? And just one last question about your own writing. Any aspects of Burke or Scrutin where you're really striving to emulate their craftsmanship in your own writing?
Yeah, I love the way that Scrutin. I love the way that Scrutin mocked avant-garde 20th century art. And you get to see a bit of that in the documentary Why Beauty Matters, but there were many essays that he wrote maybe 10 to 15 years ago, where he was satirizing and jeering the kind of abstract expressionism that you know sells for $50 million, $100 million at auction today. And I learned so much about beauty and common sense reading Roger Scrutin. You'll find references to common sense occasionally in Burke's writing, but you really have to. It wasn't until I started reading commentaries on Burke that I started seeing common sense was the thing that he was driving at, even when he wasn't using that term. And Scrutin was very good at like drafting on the same appeals to common sense that made Burke strong. I do think Scrutin was just wittier than Burke. He was funnier. And when Scrutin had his claws out, I think he was unmatched.
I know you'll remember this, but in his Oxford primer on beauty, at one point, 3/4 of the way through, he says, you know, when Duchamp first revealed his urinal, that was kind of funny in that it was a bit of a hoax, a joke. But then everybody who followed and did the reproduction, the recap of the recap, it just became so derivative. There was nothing there, right? It was just sort of painful to watch. So I remember those things well, that Scrutin was able to pillory properly.
Yes.
Well, that's a good moment for us to transition because like Burke and Scrutin, you have been very interested in how to communicate to the general public. And your first book, which we're not going to talk a lot about today, is of interest, and we'll put it in the show notes here because I'd love for folks to figure out how to be unlucky. I'm sure there's a provocative statement there in your title and subtitle. Subtitle being something they'll never forget. But your more recent work or forthcoming Love What Lasts is of interest. Where are you headed now? What's your next book going to be about? Give us a foretaste.
Well, Love What Lasts is it's a book that's hard to put in just one genre. It's a little bit of a history book. It's a bit of an aesthetics book. It's an aesthetics theory, or a theory of aesthetics.
Yeah.
It has certain theological ramifications as well. And while I'm probably going to lose some people here, I might say also, this is not a genre that I would typically endorse. I guess it's probably a bit of a lifestyle book as well. It's about how we spend our time and our money, how we choose what we spend our time and money on. And I propose a few standards for how time and money ought to be spent when it comes to, well, not just when it comes to art and music, but just when it comes to any sort of decision where beauty matters, where beauty's on the line, where you have a choice between going a route that's more sensual versus more intellectual, something that's more trendy versus more traditional. And the argument is not you should always choose something traditional no matter what, and trendy things are always bad, but that we have to be very careful how we live. And if we're not careful how we live, and if we're not taking a careful inventory of the kind of things that we dress ourselves with and put into our minds, and put to our ears, and put to our eyes, that we will end up going along with a flow, the flow of popular culture, which tends from bad to worse, and many years of a life can be wasted simply going along with a cultural flow that's constantly rendering itself obsolete.
This is a powerful message, but I think if you do end up in the lifestyle section of the local bookstore, who knows? You might pick up a few more members of an audience that didn't know what they were getting into, and
that's
might
Hopefully.
get some good stuff. Yeah, that's right.
Fingers crossed.
Now let's talk for a bit, because this is really why we wanted you on the show. You've written a couple of pamphlets, two of them specifically, one for parents, one for students of those who are considering attending a Christian classical school like Veritas, where you work. The first one, so your parents is a quote, this is the title. So your parents are thinking of sending you to a Christian classical school. It sounds like a 19th century title, my friend, or maybe even a little earlier. It's good stuff. But what are you trying to do in this first one as compared with the introduction to classical that you provide for parents? How do those two audiences, how do you approach them differently in your making a case, if you will, for classical? Maybe I'm leading too far along here, but tell us a little bit about those two broadly.
So your parents are thinking of sending you to a classical Christian school fills this void in the application process. In the application process as it currently stands, there's very little literature which is given to students. And when you have a second or a third grader, they don't have I wouldn't say that a prospective second or third grader doesn't have and shouldn't have a lot to say about whether they go to a certain school or not. But by the time you hit 7th grade or 8th grade, if you're going to go to a classical Christian school, not only do the parents need to understand what the education is, really by that point, the student needs to understand it to some extent. And the student needs to be able to say whether a classical Christian education is consistent with the way that their family lives. So what I want students to think about is I want to give them a description of a classical Christian education. And I want to ask them, is this consistent with your family? Is it consistent with what you value as a family? Is it consistent with what your church values? Or would a classical Christian education be this huge monkey wrench thrown into the life of your family, where everything about the way that you live at home, everything about the way you spend your money, everything about the way that you go to church, the church that you go to, is really working against the goals of a classical Christian education. And I felt the need to write this because I think there's a lot of schools out there right now, and classical Christian education is growing rapidly. There's a lot of schools out there that are bringing people in before they really know what a classical Christian education is, or whether they even want one or not. And I mean, classical Christian schools have a reputation for turning out high test scores. They tend to be nice, polite, safe. You're not going to get, fashionable cultural Marxism in the literature classes. You're not going to get, fashionable identity politics or that sort of thing. And sometimes that's all that parents really want. But there's a big difference between running from critical race theory and the woke public school. There's a big difference between running from that and running towards a classical Christian education. And so the pamphlet is to help students at about the 7th or 8th grade level think through whether this makes sense of the life of your family. And before I wrote the pamphlet, I noticed that there wasn't anything that was being given to high school students to read in the application process.
Yeah.
They're being asked a few questions. They were a part of the interview. But most of the literature that was going in the informational packets was aimed at parents.
Yep.
And I think that at about 7th or 8th grade, you need to be a part of that conversation, not just sit by and watch the decision be made.
Yeah. I think you're onto something here, and I'm less familiar, at least not intimately familiar, with Christian classical, but I see it in classical charters, secular contexts, where families are attracted because of the things that you've mentioned, the quality of the community, certainly test scores and achievement, college entrance, but they don't necessarily know what classical is.
Right.
And thus find themselves at some point, particularly when their adolescent begins maturing, somewhere in that 7th, 8th grade period, when they start to ask questions, and it becomes more of an open question, right, for the family. So for students, I was really I was pleased. Right out front, you warned them in your pamphlet, this isn't a promotional piece, right? It actually could be used as evidence that the Christian classical school is not for you or for your family.
Right.
It's not an easy read. I mean, you lead off with all of these caveats, or let's just be clear. I'm not going to try to twist your arm.
Right.
Are you trying to turn students away, Josh?
There's a sense in which, yes, I am. I'm not trying to turn any particular kind of person away. I am trying to turn people away who don't actually want a classical education. If you don't want a classical education, don't force yourself on the school. Don't make the teachers have to force the education on the student. I would hope that a classical education could be possible for anyone in any walk of life, provided that they actually wanted it.
Right.
So I understand what headmasters mean when they say a classical education is for everybody. I get that. It's a human education.
Right.
And if you're human, then you qualify. Black, white, rich, poor. This is a human education. And if you're black or white or rich or poor or tall or short, you're still human. And so you need a human education. I get that. But at the same time, if you don't want a classical education, don't pretend like you do. If you don't want a classical education, don't lie. Don't lie and pretend like you do. But I also think that the school needs to own up to the fact that a lot of the presentations about classical Christian education that are given to prospective families are about as gentle and appealing, and it's often quite soft the way that it's presented. And there's a lot of people that are being brought into classical schools who have gotten the presentation on classical education from the admissions officer, who is not a teacher. And if you listen to the way that, say, a literature teacher or a chemistry teacher or a fifth grade teacher describe classical education, a lot of times it doesn't sound like what they give you at the pitch when you're taking the tour. And I think this is a huge problem. I think that schools would avoid a lot of, especially discipline problems, but just clashes with parents if parents got a better description of classical education up front. And so the goal of both of these pamphlets really isn't exactly to scare people off, but it is maybe a little. It is to present classical education the way that you're going to experience it over the next 2 or 3 years.
Right.
And it's not this kind of soft, appealing, why would anybody not possibly want this? It's a description of some of the difficulties and some of the sacrifices you're going to have to make in order to really get a classical education. And I think it's fair and right that people should get those descriptions up front. Like, I mean, even the Lord says to his followers, like, full disclosure here, the world hates me, they're going to hate you too. Like, there's no big surprise. Like, even, a great leader lets his followers know the cost of discipleship.
That's right. Yeah.
And so I think the same thing needs to be true of the school.
I think there's some value here that's been overlooked. To put it harshly, you just don't want to see a school providing or doing a bait and switch, as it were, right?
Yes.
With admissions and with the presentation, it just looks so appealing. How would anyone turn away? And then they discover, well, perhaps for whatever reason or set of reasons, it's really not for us.
Right.
It'd be better to get that out up front and allow the
Absolutely.
self-selection to take place, right?
Yep.
So you touch on a number of facets in the course of this description of what students should expect.
Yeah.
You spent some time on the function of uniforms, why the uniforms, how they work. We could talk about that a bit, but almost everywhere that classical proceeds and grows within this country, we will see or hear an explanation or at least an invocation of truth, goodness, and beauty in the learning process.
Yeah.
I'd like to skip to this in part. I'd like just sort of to narrow in or zoom in on this. Explain, if you would, to our listeners how truth, goodness, and beauty relate to classical Christian education.
A classical education stages an encounter between the student and truth, goodness, and beauty. One of my old teachers from high school, I think someone who's been on this show in the last couple months, Chris Schlecht, said in a conversation I had with him in the last couple of years that the teacher cannot force virtue on the students, but the teacher can create conditions that are favorable for the creation of virtue or for the cultivation of virtue. I like the way that he puts it. I think that's very sound. And so in staging these encounters between the student and true things, good things, and beautiful things, the teacher tries to create the conditions or to create conditions that are favorable toward the student seeing that a virtuous life is a happier life than a vicious life. Truth, goodness, and beauty are the things that it's a love of truth, goodness, and beauty that creates virtue in the human person. And a classical education is not merely about staging encounters between truth, goodness, and beauty, but in cultivating the virtue that grows out of the love of these three things. So I guess that's the way I'd describe the connection.
Well, you do, and I think you do it quite well. I don't think, though I know your comments and your experience are derived specifically from a Christian religious context, but I think much of what I read there would be applicable to any of these classical charters that are operating throughout the country. You also make mention of, you have a section in the pamphlet entitled Good Taste, which I thought sounded almost quaint.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about the good taste factor, because I think this really is a distinctive, which certainly in years past, we would have used that language, but as I say, it's almost Victorian to talk about good taste. How does that factor into a classical education?
You're probably right. Yeah, good taste is good taste makes people nervous. Like it's a turn of phrase that
Sure.
like the sinner who's itching in the pew. We hear about good taste, and we start thinking about all the lousy pop music that we listen to and all the TV shows that we waste our time on. We're like, I hope this part of the lecture gets over rather quickly. The whole concept of good taste makes people either nervous or defensive. They feel like they're going to have to, as soon as somebody talks about good taste, they're like, I'm going to have to justify my love of Maroon 5 here. And I don't know that I can do that. I just like it. You know that Maroon 5 is inexcusable trash. But you like it. And so you're nervous that somebody's going to try to make you prove that you're spending your time well. I think good taste is the love of good things and the enjoyment of good things. And it's a thesis of the pamphlet, and it's a thesis of my next book, Love What Lasts, that good things and beautiful things are somewhat hard to like. We should not assume that beautiful art is easier to like or easier to love than highly sensual art. We should not assume that that a very good book like the Divine Comedy is easier to love than some page turner paperback thriller on the New York Times bestseller list. The things that are easy to like appeal to our senses and don't ask much of us. That's not classics. Good things ask more of us. And they offer more to us on an intellectual level. But the purpose of good things is not to provide pleasure. It's at least not the primary purpose of them. The primary purpose of popular music, we'll just take music for an example. The primary purpose of popular music is to give you pleasure. And if it doesn't give you pleasure, you just find something else.
Yep, next station. Right?
Next station, right? So the example that I use, I've been using this example all the time over the last several years, is if a pop song comes on a top 40 station and you don't like it, no sane person says, I'm going to learn to like this pop song. Pop music is not worth learning to like. It exists entirely for your pleasure. And if it doesn't give you pleasure, then you just find something that does. So, Drake, Maroon 5, their latest song on the radio, if it doesn't do anything for you, just find something else. On the other hand, like a piece of classical music, Debussy's La Mer. Debussy's La Mer is pleasant. It doesn't offer the like raw ultra pleasure of pop music because it's intellectual as well. And it asks something of you. It asks for your attention, and it asks for your attention for a long time. And it asks you to pick up on subtleties. It asks you to quiet your spirit, that the song might kind of delicately play upon you, subtly play on you. So I think that I think that good things offer more in the long run. But I think that there's some real confusion about the nature or the relationship between pleasure and beauty, and that we're often tempted to assume that beautiful things are going to be easy to like, when in fact beautiful things often take some work to learn to like. Unless you're going to claim to be a very good person, it's going to take an adjustment on your part to like very good things, because they're not like you. They're unlike you, which means that you're going to have to change to learn to like them. But anyway, long story short, learning to enjoy, learning to take pleasure from good things, learning to delight in good things is good taste.
Well, as you put it, and I've got a quote here that I thought was certainly repeatable. To love those golden things, we must learn as much about old beauties as we can. Until we can name all of them and distinguish them one from another, they'll seem to us like nothing more than silly and dull mysteries.
Yeah.
I just found that really evocative, right? That we're trying to initiate the young, ourselves continuing this initiation into something that is by far anything but dull. It's certainly not silly. And yet we have to acquire a taste, right? You conclude this pamphlet to the students with some very straightforward questions that they need to consider. What are you afraid of missing out on, right? If you went to this school, a classical Christian school, what are you going to miss out on? You say, what does the school offer that others will not? And then, as you said earlier, the beliefs of your family, are they compatible with this outlook? Now, how do those three questions help the student and, of course, the family properly discern whether the classical Christian school is the right fit?
I think that they ask the student and the family to acknowledge that they're going to have to give up some pleasant things in order to get a classical education. And so I wouldn't say that a classical education is I wouldn't sell it on the grounds that it's pleasant. I think it's easy for admissions officers to kind of put it that way. And so the family that's enrolling is like, okay, everything's about to get much better. We're leaving behind this lousy secular school or government school or whatever. And now our lives are going to be filled with beautiful things. Like the good times are here. The good old days are just starting. And this is going to be the golden age in the history of our family. And parents are having these fantasies like, now my children are going to be obedient. They're not going to want to listen to Eminem anymore. And it's not.
Just doesn't work quite like that.
It doesn't quite work quite like that. Yeah, it's oftentimes going to be a kind of long and drawn out process. Mm-hmm. And those good things are going to come by way of a sacrifice of more pleasant things, right? Mm-hmm. You can have your good things now, or you can have them later. And vice and pleasure are always this kind of immediate offering, whereas virtue is this long game. And so I would say that signing up for a classical education means playing the long game. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean like there's not going to be any immediate benefits to it. There will be immediate benefits to it. There's going to be immediate setbacks too. There's going to be things that occur in the first couple of weeks where you're going to say, I mean, if you weren't prepped right, you'd be like, well, I wasn't expecting that. So I think that people are going to be happier with the school if they acknowledge up front what the unpleasant things are that they're going to have to endure and what the pleasant things are that they're going to have to give up. This might seem like a very dramatic analogy. But I mean, I would say if I was giving advice to a young man who was getting married, absolutely, I'd say get married. But get married with your eyes open and recognize what you're going to have to give up in the first year of your marriage. After you get married, like you are not going to have a happy marriage if you try to spend as much time with the boys after you get married as before you got married. Mm-hmm. You're about to have less time. You're about to have less, discretionary spending. You're not going to be able to watch what you want to watch whenever you want to watch it. Now somebody else's tastes have to be taken into account. The virtues and vices of the person that you marry are going to have to be accounted for in all that you do. And so, this is nothing against marriage at all, but like any good counsel to a young person on the cusp of marriage is going to include some just very basic facts about the difficulties of marriage. And you're just going to have a happier marriage if you acknowledge those things up front than if you get into the marriage. If a man gets into a marriage and like 3 weeks after he marries, he's like, all right, well, I'm going to go play cards with the boys on a Friday night. Your wife's like, well, I thought we were going to watch a movie together. You need to know that moment's coming so it doesn't take you by surprise. And so you're not embittered when it happens. Like you need to begin preparing yourself for that before it actually happens. And I think there's some things that are difficult about classical education that you need to start spiritually preparing yourself for before you actually get there.
Well, if we can transition just a bit and talk about the pamphlet you wrote for the parents, okay? Yeah. I think this orientation that you're offering them does a little bit of what you've just described for students in helping them to understand what it is that they may need to anticipate or expect.
Yeah,
it's a pithy formulation that you provide at the outset. That this form of education really is about the pursuit of virtue, about a form of excellence or formation of the individual. And as you've said repeatedly, and as your forthcoming title points to, it is about valuing those things that last.
Yeah.
So then you dig into the nature of old things, or what it means to be a deep soul, or to possess a control of one's passions, right? To obtain standards of goodness and so on. Let's go ahead and just dig into this a little bit so that folks can anticipate, if they do pick up your pamphlet, what they're going to get here in about, 15 pages or so?
Yeah.
Quite
brief.
How do most of our contemporaries view those old things that you take on in this piece? How do typical parents view the old things that you're talking about and that we promote within the classical school?
Man, I'm not opposed to generalizing, but it's hard to generalize.
Okay.
I guess I would say that there's several distinct camps, as regards old things. And it's at this point, it's a little hard to say which camp is the most numerous or the most significant. But I will say that it's bizarre at a classical school how many times over the years I have asked a class of sophomores, why do we study old things? And like 4 or 5 of them give me the George Santayana quote, or a paraphrase of it: "Those who don't study the past are condemned to repeat it." It's a bizarre thing to hear at a classical school. Like Santayana's quote is arguably the most perfectly progressive sentiment imaginable. And there's even like these boilerplate Republican kids that are saying, "Well, if we don't study the past, we'll repeat it." Like, there's nothing in the past that you want to repeat? And then they're like, "Well, yeah, I guess there are." Well, good. That's kind of what we're doing here. We're repeating. I mean, when we reread the Iliad, we're repeating the past. When we read the Divine Comedy, we're repeating the past. Like, all this is a repeating of the past. So I think that there's this kind of knee-jerk reaction that even people at classical schools have to the study of old things, where they just say the first thing that comes to mind, or they repeat the first quote that comes to mind. That's about studying the past. And they're like, "Oh yeah, studying the past. You got to do it so you don't make the same mistakes." And if you pressed those people, I think that they would admit, okay, there's more to studying the past than just not doing what you read. There's also the kind of positive examples. But I do think that there's a lot of people who end up in classical schools that think, or are under this impression, this odd impression, that teachers with the Iliad in one hand are reading it and just telling students over and over again, "Yep, don't do that. Don't do that." And that, yeah, you don't want to do that either. "Yep, this is all pretty bad. Good thing Homer made this record of things not to do for us." I think that there's a healthy contingent of people that think that. I think that there's also some misapprehension. I think it's less problematic than the camp I just described. I think that there's some people that think that classical education is about restoring the past or bringing back a golden age. And I don't think that's true. I am skeptical of the concept of the golden age. I'm willing to admit that there are certain aspects of a culture that may decline or grow. And I happily say I think men's fashion was better 70 years ago than it is today. But I don't think that means there was a golden age that we're trying to get back. I think that if a golden age is really golden, it wouldn't be in the past. I think it would last. If a golden age doesn't last, I'm not content it was ever golden in the first place. I do think that there are golden things, though. And I think that a classical education is not about the restoration of a golden age. It's about the preservation of golden things. It's about keeping good things around. It's about stewarding good things. So I don't want to bring back everything from 14th century Florence, but I do want to keep the Divine Comedy around. I think the Divine Comedy is golden. I think it's, well, this is going to seem like a kitschy thing to say, but I think it's divine. I think it's transcendent. I think it has properties that defy, I think the lastingness of the Divine Comedy defies reason, that it's still around for mystical reasons. There's something very special happening anytime something is still around 700 years later.
Sure.
That almost nothing lasts. And if you like, nothing lasts, almost nothing lasts, nothing lasts. Our memories don't last, our feelings don't last. The same, like, we're heartbroken over some girl when we're 16 and we laugh about it 10 years later. Not even our deepest feelings don't even last. Which means that when we do find something that lasts, we found something very unusual. And if you find something that lasts, you've got to be a part of the continuance of that thing. I think that it's reasonable. I think it's right. I think it's pious. I think it's maybe it's just common sense that if something lasts, you should help it last. You should be a part of the lastingness of the thing. Anyway,
this sort of leads naturally to where I'd like you to conclude, because you'd make a distinction between deep and shallow souls.
Yeah.
So there's something about these golden things that needs the knowledge of which must be retained for their intrinsic worth, for their value in and of itself, but also for the value or the benefit to those who possess them or possess the knowledge of them. How do these golden things and the knowledge of them contribute to greater depth of soul, as you put it?
Yeah. Well, there's many ways of answering that question. I think that I believe that love is generative. I think that when you really love something, you want to make your own. I think that this is, the mystery of this is like the mystery of getting married and having children. Like, you love someone else so much, you want more people like that person in the world. And in that sense, love is generative. If you really love poetry, you're going to end up writing your own poetry. If you really love French cooking, you're going to end up doing some French cooking on your own. Or if you really love French food, do some French cooking on your own. Love is generative. And the love that we have for good things inspires us and compels us and obligates us, and with delight, to live out those things that we love, to increase them in the world, to make them more present, to make them more powerful, to glorify them. If you love the Divine Comedy, you want to glorify it. You want to tell everyone about it. You want to live it out. You want to live in such a way that Dante would approve of your life. If you love Augustine, if you love The City of God, if you love Boethius, if you love Jane Austen, you want to live in such a way that these people would approve of you. You want to, in a sense, you want a double portion of their spirit. You want to live out Jane Austen's life in her absence. You want to collect her mantle and walk around the world as her and be confused for her. And you believe that this is good because you believe that Jane Austen was a great human being. You believe that Dante was a great human being. So if you can, it's not enough to just know the comedy. It's not enough to just, be familiar with it and be capable of reproducing a schematic of all three of the canticles. What the classical teacher wants is the student to love this book. And I want to make a distinction here, not to love learning, to love Dante, to love the Divine Comedy, not to love learning in an abstract way, but to love learning Dante, to love learning good things, to love learning things that last, not just love the love of learning any old thing, but the love of learning good things. And in that love, incarnating after Dante's truth and goodness and beauty, incarnating after Jane Austen, her truth and goodness and beauty. So that's how I think it leads to a good life. That's how I think the love of good things ultimately manifests itself in a human life, is by living Dante's life after him, by living Jane Austen's life after her.
You know, I feel like there's so much more that we're just on the cusp of what we could say, not only about these pamphlets, but of course about the myriad ways in which classical education truly does deepen, make more capacious the soul that has the encounter, as you said, with truth, with goodness and beauty. So I don't know, but I'm just anticipating that we're going to have a second round, Josh. Just think about it. Just think about it.
Sounds fun.
This has been fantastic. Really appreciate your time. Love this conversation and hope to continue it soon.
I'd like that very much. Thank you for having me on the show.
Listen, we're going to get some show notes added to this. You let us know of some of your best reads, how parents, students, and others interested can go deeper on classical. And of course, we're going to have your website there. If anybody wants to learn more about Joshua Gibbs, we're going to have them straight to your site and they can go and get it for themselves straight from the source. Thanks for your time, Josh.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Rob.
Bye now.
Bye.